Hey all, I'm Richard Burnham, aka TheIndieLawyer, and welcome to the first installment of Lawsplaining, a series I'm going to update randomly whenever anything catches my eye legally. It'll kind of be a series of video essays on the legal side of the video game world, so you might find it interesting if you're a developer, a gamer, or even someone with a legal background who's interested in video games. Before warning, it may get a bit lawry in places. Today I'm going to discuss the legal differences between digital and physical games, why the video game industry is moving towards a subscription-based model, and some legal action Valve are currently caught up within the European Union. And, because I've been doing a lot of it, I'm going to talk about Stadia. Google Stadia is the latest introduction into the video game streaming world. I pre-ordered a Founders Edition, and I've enjoyed what I've experienced while playing Destiny 2 and Farming Simulator 2019. I've learned that video game streaming is actually pretty cool technology, that under no circumstances should I be allowed to own or operate a farm, and that my Guardian still looks pretty cool on Destiny. But let's backtrack. The streaming world is breaking new ground, and a lot of people are upset about it replacing more traditional platforms and physical releases. I must admit, I do love a physical game. There's just something about the box art and the manual inside, but that's because I'm a 90s kid. I also love pushing a button and having a game download immediately to my PC or Switch without requiring me to leave the house. Despite my 90s nostalgia, I don't think streaming services are evil. I think if they're done right, they offer us a good alternative from the gaming world's gradual slide towards a freemium game model. I'd personally much rather pay X pounds a month to access a collection of premium and complete games than spend money on in-game items on a freemium model basis. But the move towards video game streaming presents a number of legal issues that don't quite sit right with me, particularly relating to your right to resell or exchange the games that you buy. You've probably heard before that there's a legal difference between physical and digital versions of video games. This is because for a long time our laws focused and evolved around physical items, so much so that when digital content became much more mainstream, it just wasn't prepared for it. In fact, it wasn't long ago in the UK that if you purchased two types of the same video game, one digital and one physical, you'd have completely different consumer rights for both copies of the game. I managed to write a 15,000 word dissertation about this at university, and if you're having trouble sleeping, get in touch and I'll send you a copy. Because video games sit in a strange legal position between digital and physical, there's long been an argument about whether video games are sold or licensed. The difference between selling and licensing is that a license is basically a very detailed rulebook about how someone can use a video game. In theory, if you breach the license, the game's developers can suspend your access to the game, even if it's not an online game, and force you to stop playing. Obviously, back in a day where the majority of games weren't online, if you breached this license, the developer was unlikely to ever find out. Even if they did, they probably weren't going to come to your house and restrict your access to the game or take your disc away. It might have been possible in theory, but it would involve a great amount of expensive surveillance and court applications on their part, so probably wasn't going to happen. Now, however, the position is much different. If you breach the agreement of a game like Fortnite, for example, the developer can simply wield the ban hammer and you can kiss goodbye to your access to that game and all of your in-game content. And it's usually quite annoying, lengthy and painful to fight any decision of the developer on this front. The headline point about a video game license is it usually will contain a restriction preventing you from transferring your license to someone else. With a physical game, you can easily sell your game to someone else. You give them the disc or cartridge and they give you their money. With a license, however, whether you can transfer it or not depends entirely on the terms of the license, which will be backed up by some kind of DRM protection preventing someone else from using that content without a specific code. This has long sat uneasily with consumer law, particularly in the EU, where free movement of goods has always been championed, which brings us on to something called the exhaustion principle. It's going to get lawry. So what is the exhaustion principle and why should you care about it? Well, the exhaustion doctrine is a principle of EU law and essentially provides that once an author sells some form of copyright protected work within the European Economic Area, it can be freely sold on within that zone. It's super controversial because it cuts a strange line between the rights of the copyright holder and the idea of having a free market, and ultimately in the EU, the free market wins out. What this very basically means is that consumers usually have a right to resell things like software on one occasion. So as a basic example, if I licensed you a software product, you could sell that license to your friend, but after that point, your interest in the software ends and your friend continues. There are a few restrictions to the exhaustion principle that have developed over time, with the main ones coming from a case called Oracle v. Ubisoft. For the exhaustion principle to apply, the first sale of the license must have taken place within the EU, the license duration must be perpetual, meaning it lasts forever, the license must be fully paid up, and the seller must have rendered any copies they retain unusable. Video game companies and publishers, or their lawyers anyway, have tried to argue for a long time that the exhaustion principle doesn't apply to video games and they should be capable of being licensed on any terms they set down. The reason for this is obvious, because they can sell more if a license can't be transferred between people. Everyone has to buy their own copy and they make more money. Again, whether you support this idea depends on your personal or economic viewpoint, but you can see both sides. Developers want the ability to maximise the returns on their games, and consumers want the ability to buy games at second-hand prices without having to pay full retail price. Now, we've touched on why the legal position behind the exhaustion principle isn't clear-cut in Law 101, and it's because a computer game comprises of several different copyright works. For this reason, computer games are protected under the Copyright Directive and not simply as a computer program under the Software Directive. I warned you about the law, which means that they don't engage the exhaustion principle as neatly as software does. And this argument's been raging for some time. Steam, for example, has long argued that it provides games on a subscription-based model rather than selling them, and as an attempt to get around the exhaustion principle. They say that you're not buying the game, you're paying a subscription fee to access the games from your library within Steam. Sounds a bit dubious, right? Well, in September 2019, an interesting French case came around addressing this point exactly in the European Union. Now, this case looked at the right of consumers in the European Union to resell the games they purchased on Steam, initiated by a French consumer rights organisation against Valve. I won't try to pronounce her name because my French is diabolical, claiming that certain clauses within Steam's terms and conditions were unlawful on the basis that they infringed certain European consumer rights laws. The consumer body argued that these clauses should be deemed to have no effect on consumers and that Valve should be forced to delete the relevant clauses for their European operations. The important clause, and why this case attracted so much attention, was Clause 1C, which prohibits Steam users from reselling the right to access their games on Steam to another person. Now, ultimately, the French court agreed that Steam's terms didn't appear to align with EU consumer law, in particular the right for free movement of goods, which is of course protected through the exhaustion principle. And one point that the court focused on is that downloading a game via Steam was essentially a purchase because it made available to the consumer for an unlimited amount of time, as opposed to a subscription model, which of course only lasts for a limited amount of time. The court also ruled that there wouldn't be any distinction to be made between physical and digital games when considering a person's ability to resell a game that they own, which is super sensible and should definitely just be the legal position in general. The result of the decision, in principle at least, is that neither Valve or any other developers can object to the resale of their games when they're downloaded in France. Now, obviously, Valve didn't like this decision and therefore haven't changed their terms and conditions to allow users to transfer their games between one another, pending an appeal to the European Court of Justice, who will make a decision on the point of law. It's not really clear which way this is going to go, to be honest. There are legal opinions, including one for the European Court's Advocate General, that's basically a very experienced lawyer, that suggests that the exhaustion principle can only apply to computer software, and because of the difference between computer games and pure software, it could be excluded from the exhaustion principle in general. The German courts have also ruled in favour of Valve in similar cases, so at the moment it's a bit up in the air. We're unlikely to find out what the position will be until the Court of Justice of the European Union has a say. Now, if I had to take a guess, I think the court might come down on the side of video games falling outside of the exhaustion principle due to video games being a weird copyright hybrid. If that happens, then I think we'll see some kind of EU directive formally clarifying the position fairly sharpish after, or as fast as the legal process moves anyway. Obviously, for my friends in the UK, apparently we left the EU last month, so we'll see what happens on this point after the transition period ends in December of this year. It wouldn't surprise me if we see a move away from this kind of thinking and more towards permitting video games to be more strictly licensed. But the problem annoyingly doesn't stop quite there. Even if we get a nice decision about consumer rights in licensed video games, streaming of video games will probably completely undo everything that we've spoken about so far. Streaming is obviously quite different from buying a game from the Epic or Steam stores. In the case of Google Stadia, for example, you're basically paying a fee to access a beefy Stadia server and the right to play games on that server. Here, streaming servers will likely argue, we're not licensing the games to you at all, you're paying a fee to access and play that game on our server. And that's very different from licensing a copy of the game and installing it on your computer. In this instance, your hardware isn't involved beyond displaying the output from the server. So how have Google structured this legally? Now, if you're a Stadia user, I'm sure you've read through the terms and conditions in detail before ticking that I have read the terms and conditions box. If you're not a Stadia user, I've read the Google Terms of Service, so you don't have to. But Google have very much adapted the legal language which supports more of a move away from the selling model. The terms of service are very heavily slanted towards access to a service. Now, Google mostly passes on responsibility for individual licenses for Stadia games to the developers and publishers making the games, most of which will probably supply limited and revocable licenses, which are usually an attempt to get around the exhaustion principle and argue that the game's licensed, not sold. It's worth noting that if a publisher doesn't provide a license, then Google puts in place a simple and limited license to use the content on Stadia on their behalf. If you're in North America, this agreement is actually set out in a separate Stadia end-user license agreement for Stadia games, which is much clearer about your position. The document states that the content's licensed to you, not sold, and the publisher grants you a limited, non-exclusive license to access and use the content for which you have an entitlement for your personal, non-commercial use through Stadia. Simple. This combination is more likely to support a model where you really are not being sold a game at all and simply licensing it. After all, if your Stadia access disappears, what are you going to do with an executable copy of a game that only operates on Stadia? With Steam, there's a guide for how you can use games that you've purchased away from the Steam platform. It's not the case with services like Stadia so far. Google Stadia muddles things a bit because alongside your premium subscriptions, you also got a right to buy a game which is then yours. You only have access to premium games from Stadia Pro provided you're a Stadia Pro subscriber. This makes it a bit more like Steam in the sense that you buy your games and store them in a library, but of course, unlike with Steam, you don't download your content and store a copy on your computer, and again, without the Stadia service, it's somewhat pointless. Ultimately, this is a brand new area, and the law is always playing catch up with developments in technology. You may well see some kind of legal intervention to circumvent the precarious legal position in streaming in the future. Like I said before, I think this is more likely to come from the European Union to begin with, who seem to have the legal landscape down on the video game front. These decisions are actively shaping the evolution of the gaming industry. Hopefully this video is giving you a bit of background as to why it's happening and what's going on currently. Like it or hate it, the technology is on its way. Google Stadia is one of the first big examples of this happening. Do I hate streaming games? No, not at all. But there does need to be a fair position for consumers, particularly if they're paying £40 to £50 for access to content they may have no rights over. For me, I'm old school. I still like to have some control over my games and ultimately the right to resell them, even though I've got a Steam library full of games I'd never play. Anyway, so what do you think of Stadia and the world of streaming video games? Like it? Hate it? Are you for or against the move towards games as a service? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, I'm the Indie Lawyer. Catch you later.